Welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we talk about the week's hottest legal topics. This week, we have the Trump trial still going on, the civil fraud trial in New York, and we've had two of the Trump children take the stand and actually testify. That's big news. The other big news we've had this week is, and I'm trying to get the name right, is it Fried Bankman?
Nope, Bankman-Fried.
Bankman-Fried. Okay, thank you. So we've got Sam Bankman-Fried. The FTX trial has also been going on, which is amazing because it's the two different trials for fraud by billionaires. So we're going to talk about fraud by billionaires on today's session, as well as hitting a little bit of the 14th Amendment issue that keeps coming up. We've had this week in the news, the trial hearings have started in Colorado, and there's been a full week of testimony regarding whether Trump is barred from being on the ballot because of the 14th Amendment. So we're going to talk about that. It also started in the Supreme Court of Minnesota, a similar case in a different state, a little bit different arguments, but the similar arguments about the 14th Amendment, about Trump being on the ballot. So those are our biggest updates. We're going to talk a little bit about each of them in turn to see how it's going and what our legal take is on it. I'm Virginia Tehrani. I'm with Tehrani Law, LLC, because you never need a lawyer till you do.
Until you do.
Exactly. Now, if you're named Trump or any of these other defendants or parties in any of these cases, I am not their attorneys. Nor do I want to be anybody's attorney. I am here to just critique.
No, wait, you want to be someone's attorney. You just do not want to be Trump's attorney.
Correct. There's a bad track record of what happens to Trump's attorneys. So count me out. We're just going to critique from the what's the best word? From the cheap seats?
Fair enough.
Okay. Yeah, from the cheap seats. It's
or
our
peanut gallery.
Right. Peanut gallery and cheap seats. We could work in either one, which means Dean John Vial is also in the cheap seats. He's with us from Middle Tennessee State University. He's a constitutional law scholar, as well as a scholar on the Constitution and its amendments. So this is the legal team you have going for you on the Weekly Wine. Thanks for joining us. Okay. Now, Dr. Vial, a quick wine. We've gotten critiques that we need to shorten up this section, so you know what we're going to be talking about. We're going to do that in just a second, but I do have to say, I know summer is gone. As an homage to summer, the waning bygone summer, I have chosen to do a mango sangria today from Linganore Wine Cellars. We went Maryland, so I've gotten a couple of wines from Maryland. I'm in Maryland. That's where I live and I work. So we thought maybe we'd do a little bit of a taste of Maryland. We've done a Linganore or two before. Love them, so hopefully we will enjoy this last homage to summer. And cheers to you, Dr. Vial, and here we go. Your water? You got your water?
Got it.
Fantastic. Cheers. Lovely. And cheers to all of you. Grab your favorite glass of wine or whatever you've got, and let's get into this. So, Dr. Vial, as I understand it, through this week, we've been hot on the trail of the civil fraud trial against, I believe it's former President Trump, his eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., his son, Eric Trump, a couple of, I believe, accountants, and then the trusts and the organization. So the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust, the Trump Organization, etc. And as I understand it, and I want to do a recap, Dr. Vial, I think there have been some findings that were done before this testimony even started.
It's right. It's a judge trial. And the judge has already decided that fraud occurred. The hearing, as I understand it, is to determine the extent and what the penalties might be. And I believe the penalties can go at least up to $250 million, but they could also affect licensure to do business within New York, which is where, the primary place where the Trump organization does its business. So it could be fairly consequential.
And the judge already had revoked the license. So upon the finding, He revoked the business licenses that they had for New York. But right now, those have been reinstated pending
They've
an
been
appeal.
stayed, right? That injunction has been stayed. Yes.
Okay. But the appeal is separate than this trial.
That's right. That's right. That's in another court.
Okay.
But I believe this judge may, though, have stayed that judgment until it got to the appellate case. I believe that's what happened.
So it's hard, though, in hearing all of this trial testimony, even though I understand the background as to what it's for and why, it really is hard to separate it from a trial on the merits. Because it seems when we're hearing Donald Trump Jr. talk, when we're hearing Eric Trump talk and say, I didn't do it, it was them, it really seems like well, did they do it or didn't they do it, rather than that's already been decided. So what do we say overall their testimony is geared toward?
It's a great question. I mean, I suppose you could argue that there was guilt, but there wasn't guilt at the very top. That would be difficult because usually the chief executive has the term chief in there because they're supposed to be supervising those below them. I mean, again, part of it goes to the amount of the damages. I think that's the primary thing. I suppose to the extent that that either Donald Trump or his sons who directed the company while he was president, to the extent that they were knowing participants and perhaps even provocateurs or the sort of the minds behind the revaluations, then their monetary culpability would be greater than had they not been so involved.
Yeah, I kind of see it as they're clearly finger pointing. And I will make a really quick summary of their testimony. I've been on the edge of my seat as an attorney waiting for the Trumps to take the stand. And one of them finally took the stand Wednesday, Donald Trump Jr., and it was really a letdown. It's like, oh, that was it. That's all he had to say. There weren't many fireworks. There weren't those aha moments or Perry Mason moments in the courtroom. Then Eric gets on and takes the stand, and there weren't really any big Perry Mason moments. There was one little one, but I've been fairly bored by their testimony.
Yes, but we don't know what the implications might be in separate criminal trials.
Oh, true.
If it can be shown that perjury occurred, then you have a whole different ball of wax. And again, because Trump is involved in so many different litigations right now, there's always a chance that statement. And this is why, I mean, they say that Trump is going to be called to testify on Monday.
Right.
You're the attorney, but he does have the right, if he thinks that something he says could be used to incriminate him in a criminal trial, to say that. And he has invoked, although he's pontificated against people who take the Fifth Amendment, he has done it himself on occasion, and might be advised to do so. Now, whether he will heed his attorney's advice, might be another matter. I think Monday will be the far more interesting case. You know, the other fascinating development in this case is there's still back and forth arguments over the judge's aide.
I saw that.
Is Trump's attorneys this time are still making the argument that she is biased, and presumably they're doing it to for the record's sake.
Yeah.
But nobody seems really to have introduced any evidence that she's biased, other than she's had her picture taken with another politician.
Correct.
And they're really skating a pretty fine line here. They've already been fined, 5,000 once and 10,000 a second time. So that'll be something fascinating to watch as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am looking forward to is a bad word because it implies like I'm really happy about it, but I'm not. But legally speaking, and in this arena, I've said it a few times on this program before, is we're in such fascinating legal times. It's hard not to be excited as a lawyer looking in at such a momentous case for, in the end, I don't have any personal interest as to who gets found guilty or liable in the end. But the fact that any of it is occurring is so fascinating. It is truly monumental in history. The fact that the Trump children have taken the stand is that fact in and of itself, I think, is more interesting than their actual testimony. But the fact that President Trump is going to take the stand on Monday is even more interesting. And I'm with you.
I think a lot of people might question, it almost, Trump is still sort of touting the line that he's being persecuted.
Yes.
He himself has backed off a little bit from individual criticisms other than of the judge, which has been permitted.
Right.
But he seems to be trying to burn down the whole legal system in his own defense. I have maybe on this program sometimes likened it to, I think where he's losing credibility is, the child who comes home and says, well, we would have won the game except for that one ruling by the referee. Yeah. And they might be right. Occasionally referees get it wrong. But if every time, after every game you come in and say, well, this referee was unfair and, they should have had 5 innings instead of 4, and they only gave me, 1 point after I kicked it over the field goal. And I think I should have gotten,
right.
8 for that. You begin to lose credibility. And it's really sort of, to me, the saddest thing, and this is happening more generally in Washington, anytime a department of government goes, tries to seemingly do its job, it's like, well, the IRS must be crooked, so let's defund the IRS. And the FBI is against Trump, so they must have something against him. Let's defund the FBI. And the next thing you know, we're not going to have anything other than the will of the person in power. And
right.
That's very disturbing, particularly for someone like me who's, so believes so strongly in institutional restraints throughout government.
Yeah. And you are a professor of political science. So I know that you're a dean. I know that you have the expertise in the Constitution and the amending process. But ultimately, your PhD is in political science, and you were the chairman of political science department at MTSU for decades, and you've taught it for so long. You seem to have the insight of, what is at stake in all of this politically. Do you see, what are you afraid of politically, not even personally, but as a political scientist in this entire scenario?
Well, our country is founded on the rule of law, and presidents come and go, as do members of Congress and even Supreme Court justices. The Constitution and the legal system and those institutions, they're guardrails. And the more guardrails you keep bumping into or destroying or demolishing, the less chance you're going to have that government is going to stay on track. And I feel very strongly, and I felt the same way when, it's been a while, show my age here, but when Bill Clinton continually was going after Ken Starr. And I understand it. Ken Starr had strayed quite a bit from Whitewater when he got to Monica Lewinsky. But nonetheless, either what the evidence he found was correct or it wasn't. And I think we got, something similar here. I don't like people trying to burn down the Constitution or burn down American institutions simply because they're going against them. Those who are familiar with trying to think of the play with Thomas More, where he basically talks about, the importance of law, and, you can take this guard down and this guard down, but before you know it, we're all defenseless. That, I think, is the primary concern here.
Yeah, I think to me, it's almost as if, and you all forgive me for a poor analogy, but in my own mind, growing up with so many churches and in the church, it's almost as if there was a pastor in charge of the church. The pastor steps down and the church splits because the members were dedicated to the pastor, not the church.
Right.
So to me, it's almost a division of, okay, a lot of people have been excited by Donald Trump, and he seems to offer so much, and he does to many people. But it's almost as if we've gotten that the GOP is, well, we're pro-Trump or we're not. And if you're not pro-Trump, you're not Republican. Almost like we've got this little division of a church.
Right.
Is if you don't support Trump, you can't be part of our party.
And again, it's not as I tried to show with the Clinton example, it's not unique to Trump.
Right.
But it's just that he's been involved in so many of these controversies. And again, he almost from the beginning of his administration, he was against the FBI.
Right.
That used to be, the Democrats who were always concerned that the FBI was trampling on rights. And it was always the Republicans who said, no, we need law and order. And it's almost as though we've had a reversal of that.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, though, because we also have had, speaking of history and Republicans and Democrats, when Lincoln was president, the roles were reversed. As I understand it, and you're the one who knows best, I think he was actually the Democrat Party representative. But at the time, I believe that was more like the current Republican Party, or have I got that mixed up?
No, Lincoln was the first Republican president to be elected.
Okay.
But he did, there are questions surrounding Lincoln's assumption of war powers during the Civil War. If ever there was a time that the nation was in jeopardy and one needed war powers, it was probably during the Civil War. But he did on occasion suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and there were other actions that he took that some historians have subsequently questioned. It turns out Jeff Davis was doing similar things in the South, which
the leader of the Confederacy
doesn't necessarily justify it, but sort of gives you a feel for the tenor of the times.
Well, I guess outside of the entire political scheme, going back to this fraud trial, the interesting thing to me and what's been published in the media most is that both children have said, it's not us. We had, in charge of some things, but we relied on the accountants. It's them.
Right.
Very big finger pointing of, it's not us, it's them. They were the accountants. They were the experts. We just signed off on what they gave us. What do you think of that testimony?
Well, the accountants are saying, we were told this is the ultimate valuation that we get, and we were told to figure out how to get there. We were told to reverse engineering. So we have you down for $3 billion. He says he's worth $5 billion. Well, we got to figure out where we're going to make the additions. So I don't know. In terms of credibility, I suppose both have some to lose. But ultimately, again, if you're going to be the chief executive, you're going to be running a business, you don't necessarily need to know how to cook books or not to cook books as you do. You're responsible for setting sort of what is the attitude people are going to take in this business toward regulations and toward laws. Are we going to we're going to try to skirt them as much as we can? We're going to try to go by the letter or, somewhere in between.
Right.
And what they're saying is we were told, come up with this valuation, and these are the properties that we had, and this is how we did it. So both sides are sort of but again, that even if the accountants are somewhat responsible here, they're acting presumably they have to act as fiduciaries, right? They have to act in good faith of what they think their leader wants them to do. So I don't think it was a particularly good week for the Trumps. And, I think you may have mentioned in the introduction, what's fascinating about this case is there's another case that went much quicker on the West Coast. Sam Bankman-Fried, this sort of wonderkin who was involved in cryptocurrency and apparently at one time was worth, $26 billion? At least on paper. And subsequently, it appears he was convicted.
Yes, he was just convicted.
Conviction rested. He basically said, I'm a financial wizard. I really didn't even know about cryptocurrency. That was just my way of making money. And the response basically was, well, but there are rules that say when investors give you money in pot A, you can't move it over to pot B, which is for your personal use. You can give yourself a salary and that sort of thing, but you can't tell investors that you are following general accounting rules and
When
then
you're
do
not.
something different. Now, it could go on appeal, but I mean, right now he's facing up to 110 years in jail.
Right.
And I mean, what's fascinating about the two cases is, there's a frequent argument against the American legal system, which in many cases, and maybe in criminal law, even more than civil law, that money matters. And how many, well, we've had some prominent cases where people have been legally convicted, even with great counsel.
Right.
But how many cases, have we had where somebody we think really is guilty got off because they had the best lawyers in the land? And, white collar crime generally is not considered to be as serious, maybe as robbing a bank. But frankly, aside from the fact you probably didn't shoot somebody while you were doing it,
Right.
If somebody invested their retirement in cryptocurrency and the market falls out because the head of the cryptocurrency market is dealing fraudulently, that's as serious as robbing a bank. I mean, these are real life. I wish I could remember the name, but some years back there was this big Ponzi scheme in New York,
Yes.
and remember it was very similar. People invested their life savings in
Lost
this,
everything.
and so it does. I mean, there's a certain those who question the legal system. This gives me a little bit of cause for optimism that even the what is it? The bigger they are, the harder they fall.
Even the wealthiest
These are
among us.
to go from $26 billion to facing maybe 110 years in jail. That's a pretty big fall. And these are the elements of Greek tragedy. And I think it's possible that Donald Trump is on a similar trajectory here.
Well, even Martha Stewart got caught. I mean,
Well,
she
that's
was
right.
insider
That's right.
trading.
That's right. And
Another white collar fraudulent scheme.
Right. So those who say the system is rigged against them, it's not always true. I mean, there are cases where high and mighty get their kind of comeuppance as well as a local bank robber or thrift store owner or whatever.
Yeah, I think for the children, I think the goal has been, based on what I'm seeing in the testimony, is to minimize their own input, their own responsibility and culpability, where they can say, okay, everybody that we've been found liable, the defense as a whole has been found liable, but maybe I'll only get a $100,000 fine. The rest, you have to distribute it, right? You have to distribute it as a percentage among the defendants. What is each percentage of fault?
I'm not
of
sure
blame?
about that. You know the law better than I do, but it may be that if it's against a corporation, that it affects all of them. I'm not. I don't know how. I mean, I don't think they're specifically on trial, are they?
They are. They are both defendants. Ivanka Trump was taken out as a defendant, but they are both defendants.
Because of statute of limitations, right?
Correct.
And I think there is speculation that she might be the one most likely to point the finger back at Trump because the boys were operating, the sons were operating when he was in the presidency.
Correct.
Whereas she would have been working prior to that time. So she might have more intimate knowledge of what was happening when he was actually in control.
Yeah, they had every reason to say no.
This is a sad thing to think of having to call children to testify against their parents.
Yes.
I mean, that I have some sympathy there. Now, that being said, the two boys so far, their argument has already been rejected by the judge.
Correct.
Particularly their public argument, which is, these companies that loaned us money, they still made hundreds of millions of dollars. What are people complaining about? Well, they're complaining because they probably should have gotten more because they were, if the accusations are correct, they were giving loans based on a credit rating of 750 when the real credit rating was 450 or whatever the equivalence would be if you were doing an individual.
I think the biggest point I want to raise on this is I think their testimony, I think, first of all, it's two parts. First, they think they're helping themselves. I think they believe that they are minimizing their own guilt, their own liability in this. But I think it is going to completely backfire on them and their father when he testifies on Monday. Because
again, I expect him to take the fifth. And to
for
take it
some of it. Well, you expect him to. I don't think he will. I think he's going to take the stand and talk because I think he wants to. He's making public statements but those are the values of my places. His public statements that he can be questioned on, even if he takes the fifth, they can't ask him questions. Didn't you say this? He can't take the fifth as to whether he said a statement in public or not. So they can still enter his public statements where he says, but that is the value of my company. That is the value of my home. That is the value of Trump Tower. That is the value of Mar-a-Lago, where he continues to make these statements that are contrary to what the sons are saying. They're saying, okay, we're not disagreeing that these are fraudulent, but we didn't have anything to do with them. I didn't know about them. I didn't have a hand in them.
To be sure, there's going to be some subjectivity in these measures. It's not like measuring money in a bank account. My own house, I could imagine being off, X number of thousands of dollars, just depending on whether it's July or September, or
of course,
what the house recently sold next to me was, or new street going out in front, or any number of things. So, to maintain credibility, the judge does need to understand, and I think he does.
Oh yes,
that this is an inexact science. But that doesn't mean that you can just make up numbers from whole cloth either.
Correct.
There have to be some you're signing. My understanding, when you sign these papers to a bank, it's almost the equivalent of they're often. I mean, it's the equivalent of an affidavit almost.
It
isn't
is.
It?
It absolutely is.
So it's something, to the best of your knowledge, this is what you believe this to be.
Correct.
And you can't just pull numbers out, particularly, in order to get to the Forbes 100 richest people in the world.
Right. And what the judge even said, he addressed that argument, saying in his own original summary judgment that valuation is objective, that there are market values that are done by basic accounting measures that have rules and regulations as this is how you prove it. And he says good faith, quote, good faith measurements could vary by as much as 10 to 20%, which is what you're saying. But then he adds not 200%.
Right.
So what
and the most obvious example,
if
it turns out to be true, is the example of claiming at one point that you have a penthouse that's 10,000 square feet and another saying it's 30,000 square feet.
Right. 10,000 versus it's actually a little over 10,000, but he's been arguing all these years it's 30,000 square feet.
Right. I mean, that's a fairly objective, one would think, get out the measuring tape and you could probably verify or not.
And I think that's where Eric Trump is going to get in trouble because he is my understanding of his title has been that he's the executive vice president in charge of the real property, the real estate that is involved with the Trump organization and with his father, including the golf courses and Mar-a-Lago, the homes that he has. So I think that's where he gets in trouble with all these years that he's been the one in charge of this real estate empire. And if you don't know what the real estate empire is worth, you don't want to know what the real estate empire is worth because the accountants handle that, that doesn't make any sense. If you're in charge of a real estate empire, which is apparently what this executive vice presidency is for him, then you should know the valuation. You would want to know the valuation. So the question is, every time he said, I don't know, that's not my job, that's for the accountants, well, then that's not real. Nobody should be, as the executive vice president in charge of all of those companies, you don't get into real estate and not know the value.
Discourse concrete. That's his argument, which again is not, would be credible 3 or 4 rungs below, but probably not terribly credible at his level.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ruling family, right? There's a ruling family in this organization, and it's Donald Trump.
And the empire that way, as I understand it, is not that big. I mean, financially, we're discussing how big it is, but in terms of the number of employees, it's fairly top heavy with Trump's. They're not a whole lot of layers and subsidiaries and that sort of thing.
I agree.
So it's a little deceptive to say, well, I have all these underlings. Yeah, you have some accountants, you have a financial manager or two, but it's not, as I understand it, some mega conglomerate that circles the world or anything like that.
Yeah, so it's maybe not that many employees, but allegedly is extremely well valued to the Forbes billionaire list. And Eric Trump is listed as the daily control of the family business, acting as de facto chief executive, especially when Trump took office. And Donald Jr. was listed as a trustee of the entity. And as a trustee, there are certain extra duties that you have. As a financial trustee, as an attorney, I'm a trustee. I'm a fiduciary. I have certain obligations that are put on me by law that I normally wouldn't have as just a regular person. And as the trustee of a company, you have the duty to the company that you're overseeing, to the trust, to the revocable trust, to make sure that it has a fair accounting. And if there's anything that might be wrong, how many years did this go on and they couldn't have thought, well, maybe that's wrong? It just is hard to believe.
It is.
So we'll see what Donald Trump says on Monday, but my guess is he's going to, by accident, thinking that he's helping the case, throw his sons under the bus by saying, no, it is valued that way, and continue with his defense of, but the valuations are true, rather than their defense of, well, we don't know if they're true or not, but it's the accountants who made them wrong. So I think that's where I think that's where we're going to they're going to contradict each other, but we'll see. And you talked about the Bankman-Fried case, so we're going to see what happens with him. But I do want to before we end, touch back on the 14th Amendment issue, because we did start the trial this week in Colorado on the question of whether Section 3 of Amendment 14 of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, whether it bars Trump from holding office or even being on the ballot. And the ultimate arguments, Dr. Vial, I'm going to let you describe the ultimate arguments. We've talked about this quite a bit on our show, and I encourage you all to go back to our former arguments and our discussions on the Legal Weekly Wine about those. We'll put them at the end of this too. But I think that they're missing something in the Colorado trial, and from what I understand is the Minnesota argument in the Supreme Court. I think they're overlooking one key factor. But if you can give us a quick summary, if there can be a quick summary of what's happening with this amendment.
Well, start back at the beginning. So 14th Amendment is one of 3 amendments that was adopted at the end of the Civil War. 13th Amendment prohibited involuntary servitude. That was adopted in 1865. Many southern states subsequently adopted what were known as black codes, which effectively restricted transit, working arrangements, and whatever for African Americans. And so the 14th Amendment was adopted. It overturned the Dred Scott decision, which had decided that African Americans could not be citizens, and decided that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens thereof. Went on to protect such citizens with due process, equal protection of the laws, privileges and immunities of U.S. citizens.
All in Amendment 14.
Right. That's all in the first section of the 14th Amendment. Then there are subsequent sections which were designed to, one was not very effective, was designed to prevent states from taking away the right to suffrage to all males over 21. And that was evaded by a number of things. But there was also a provision, there was also a punity provision in there, because the civil, many of the people who fought in the Civil War, and particularly the leaders, Jeff Davis, for example, had been a U.S. senator. Many of the people on his cabinet had served. In fact, there's a whole book on exit speeches that Southern senators gave as they left the Union right at the beginning of the Civil War.
Wow.
And many of these people had, as part of their oath of office, had pledged to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Well, they had subsequently pledged allegiance to a Constitution that was not that of the United States. And this Section 3 was adopted to prevent people who, having made a pledge to support the Constitution, violated that trust from running for office without, and there was a provision, as I recall correctly, if I recall correctly, for Congress to lift that restriction on individuals. But it was basically to keep you, if you had already switched sides once, could we trust you again? So you would be ineligible, Robert E. Lee, unless pardoned, could never be eligible to run for president of the United States. Not that he probably would have been elected, but nonetheless. So the question now is, does this same provision apply? Did Trump on January the 6th, did he effectively violate his oath by working against the Constitution that he had sworn to uphold? So that's the key question. Now, the more difficult question is, who decides?
Right.
And then the second part of that is, can you have different decisions in different states? Can Minnesota decide, well, we think it did rise to the level of an insurrection, so we're going to bar him from the ballot in this state?
Right.
And Colorado say, well, we think it was egregious, but we don't think it rose to that level, so we're going to permit him to have the ballot. And, part of this is, it's always a tension in democracy between, the rule of law is sometimes in conflict with democracy.
Right.
The people would like to ride somebody out on a rail, but the Constitution says you got to give them due process. The people sometimes say, in fact, there's an egregious example in the last day or two of a prominent broadcaster saying all Arab American, I'm tired of Arab Americans. They all ought to go home. You can't do that.
Yeah.
Arab Americans, have the same rights as Jewish Americans or Chinese Americans or Hispanic Americans or African Americans. I mean, if you're a citizen, everybody has the same rights here. So, one of the arguments that the Trump people are making, and I have some sympathy with it, is the people ultimately are the ones who should decide this. And, we talked earlier that
it would be a political question and not a legal one.
Well, that's where I was hit, is the term is a little bit different in this context, but right. What could happen is the Supreme Court, but see, this is what I don't know. What happens if Minnesota does one thing, Colorado does another, and maybe Arizona splits the difference? And the Supreme Court says, well, we're not going to decide, we're going to leave it. Now, one thing you could say is we're going to leave it up to Congress.
Which is what Minnesota is suggesting.
Right. We'll leave it up to Congress to decide. How exactly would they decide that? And, can Congress decide anything? Is
it going to be the same as the Speaker of the House? Oh.
Yeah, we will see.
Yeah.
So what do you think they left out? What do you think is missing from the argument?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. And so we can come back to it. I've been following the arguments, and I've loved seeing the experts that they've put on the stand to say whether this was an insurrection or not. There's been heavy focus on whether Trump's statements and actions rose to the level of an insurrection that would prevent him from being on the ballot. But they're missing the second part. I have not seen, at least personally in any newscast, that either the Colorado or Minnesota case has said the second part of or supplied aid and comfort to. That they've been focused solely on insurrection and have not done the secondary argument that, okay, you don't have to have done the insurrection yourself, but you provided aid or comfort to those who have. So in my mind, it's almost a stronger argument. Not that it would win, I don't know, but it's a stronger argument to say, look at all of his public statements where he's saying they're imprisoned for a cause, where he's giving them money, he's giving them support. But it doesn't matter, right? Because if it's...
Well, maybe.
Afterwards, and I wish I had pulled up the exact section so we could read it and quote it, but I don't think that part of the section mattered as to whether it was happening simultaneously or afterwards. But to me, that's a stronger argument.
Part of the problem here is Trump's situation is tricky in that he might have had, I didn't do anything about the insurrection on January the 6th. I might have commented on it privately to people, but I didn't have anything to do with it. But I didn't have any obligation, or at least not direct obligation. A lot of what the president seems to have done that day is simply sit in his dining room and watch television and watch it unfold without apparently calling in the military, not giving a speech until relatively late in the day after much of the damage had already been done. And so part of it comes to in his response, does his responsibility of executing the law require some affirmative action when he sees that laws are being violated? And he's certainly, in other cases, when there have been riots and whatever, he's certainly spoken out and saying we ought to shoot them all, or we ought to act more forcefully. But on this day, he was strangely silent.
Not fully, though. And there are the quotes of him saying, "Go and fight."
Well, I'm thinking of. I think they occurred before the actual attack.
Correct.
But in other words, there was a 2 to 3 hour period at least where he seemed to be aware from television that these attacks were occurring and did not forcefully or immediately step in to do anything about them. And this is why, Mark Meadows, we talked earlier about, Meadows is one who seems to be his chief of staff, seems to be one who has given evidence to the special prosecutor. And he's going to be able to tell us, presumably, what Trump knew and when he knew it. And specifically, what did he tell him? What were other people around Trump telling him? And I mean, I think there's some evidence that even his daughter was trying to call him that day. And say, look, Dad, you got to do something about this.
Okay, so and I've pulled it up. Trusty phones nowadays. So the section is... So no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, and this is the one they're going against right now, the first part of it, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same. And that's the piece that these two cases are hinging on, is what constitutes insurrection or rebellion, where I believe the stronger argument is the second part, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. where this is the part where what has he been doing for all of the people who have been convicted for the January 6th incidents? What has he been saying about them, to them, for them, about the day itself? Is he providing financial support? That seems to be the easier argument, but I guess you still have to have a definition of rebellion and insurrection, where even if he didn't engage in it, is he supporting someone who did?
Right. And I haven't been able to follow these cases as much as I would like to. But there's a very arcane but brilliant argument, legal argument, that the president is not an officer of the United States.
And I think the defense is using it.
Again, you have to trace the use of that office through. It seems counterintuitive that you would think if anybody were an officer of the United States, it would be the president.
It's our figurehead.
But there are some very brilliant lawyers who have argued otherwise. And the other fascinating thing about this case, of course, is to what extent, if you did find in these states that the president was involved, then what do you do about the current Speaker of the House of Representatives, who, along with Ted Cruz, a number of other very prominent senators, said they weren't going to certify the election?
Right.
Is that also giving aid and comfort to the enemies of the United States?
Right. Or engaging in the insurrection itself by voting that way.
Yeah. I usually don't like to predict. But this one, not only do I not like to, I don't think I can. I think the issue is going to be, and particularly, what happens if you have states that come to different conclusions? And
which
you
I
would
think you're
think the
going
Supreme Court might, I guess the court could say, they could say it's a political question. They could say it's not a state matter that only Congress can decide, but I don't know what would happen if Congress essentially is inert.
Right.
Which is not all that unbelievable a scenario.
Yeah. And they do seem to be different. Minnesota has, from what I'm seeing in the news, Minnesota has been much more wary about taking up the case and kind of having the questions from the justices who are hearing it of, well, is this really our place to decide? Shouldn't it be Congress, or shouldn't it be the Supreme Court or somebody else but us? Why us? So they seem to be pushing it back, at least right now, as far as we don't want this decision, it's somebody else's. Colorado, at least at this point, it's only one judge, it's a trial court judge, to decide what role the law should have and one judge or one state should have in making this decision. But I think it was in Minnesota where one justice, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but look it up, I believe there was indication where one justice was like, look, it's going to be the Supreme Court who decides. Right. And ultimately, I think when you and I first talked about this subject, that was our conclusion as well, is ultimately it probably will end up in the lap of the Supreme Court.
Well, and there is, the Section 5 of the 14th Amendment does indicate that the primary enforcement of the amendment is by Congress.
No, that's true. Congress shall have the power to enforce.
Validity to the court saying we're not going to determine it needs to go to Congress, but it's hard to believe that Congress would do anything other than give a purely partisan vote on this. It's just hard to imagine people abstracting themselves enough from the situation to say, they're going to look at winners and losers and my side and your side and red state and blue state. And so what's fascinating about this for me is this whole argument was kicked off basically by two professors.
Right.
Who, as far as I know, are not particularly known for litigation.
Correct.
They're primarily, they do the sort of thing that I do. Read the Constitution and try to teach it to kids. And it's sort of fascinating to think that, people in the ivory tower can sometimes reach in and have an influence on what actually happens in the real world.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating topic. And by next week, we're going to have even more interesting news because Hopefully, as projected, Donald Trump will take the stand. Maybe Ivanka Trump will take the stand. Maybe we'll have full rulings even by the end of today, this Friday, on the Colorado case for the 14th Amendment, on the Minnesota case for the 14th Amendment. I believe there are a couple more out there already. But by next week, the second week of November, we are going to have even more interesting and exciting news. I continue to be amazed at what comes out each week, and we will keep you updated here on the Legal Weekly Wine. So, Dr. Vial, thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Everybody, happy hour and enjoy your weekend, and we will catch you next time on the Legal Weekly Wine.